Good evening, everyone. Thank you for being here today. We've got two wonderful panelists here who will share their insights on how academic research can feed into creative work. Our panel session will run for about 50 minutes, after which we will move on to our Q&A session. Please type your questions and send them to me through the chat function. And when the Q&A session begins, I will read out your questions to our panelists. Before we start, let me briefly introduce our panelists to you. Shehan Karunatilaka won the Booker Prize in 2022 for his novel The Seven Moons of Mali Almeida. Published by Sorted Books, Seven Moons has been translated into several languages, including Portuguese, Italian, Malayalam, and Sinhala, with a forthcoming Tamil edition. His latest publication is a collection of short stories, The Birth Lottery and Other Surprises. Shehan also writes features and has been published by The Guardian, Rolling Stone, GQ, National Geographic, and Condé Nast, amongst others. Professor Sasanka Perera is a sociologist who researches into areas of culture and its politics in South Asia, focusing on religious and ethnic identities, visual semantics, and spirit religion, including people's understanding of ghosts in specific political conditions. His work has been published extensively, with some of his work being translated into Tamil, Japanese, and Spanish. He also has an abiding interest in poetry, photography, and translating. Shehan and Sasanka, thank you for being here. So let's start with the idea of ghosts. Shehan, your book-opening novel features a protagonist who is a ghost navigating the afterlife while trying to understand how he died. Sasanka, you too have written about ghosts. Your 2001 essay, Sprayed Possessions and Avenging Ghosts, Stories of Supernatural Activity as Narratives of Terror and Mechanisms of Coping and Remembering, was published in a book called Remaking a World, Violence, Social Suffering, and Recovery. What drew you both towards ghosts, and what makes them fascinating subjects?
Well, firstly, good evening, Dr. Sasanka. It's been a while. I think it was 5 years ago at the Gratian Prize. And thanks, Thirangie, for putting this together. Shall I go first about the ghosts? Well, you asked the fascination with ghosts. I think I remember about 10 years ago, I was just minding my own business, not doing much, and I stumbled across this wonderful paper, Spirit Possessions and Avenging Ghosts by Dr. Sasanka Perera, about ghost sightings around Sri Lanka in villages that had been through trauma. And I thought, wow, I'm sure there's a book somewhere in here. And you can't see this because my screen is blurred, but this is well annotated and highlighted. But I mean, that story is partly true. I mean, it was very much part of the journey, Dr. Sasanka's piece, and that's why, we can talk about it more, what I got out of that. But I think the main reason was you pick a subject that you have some sort of fascination with. And I grew up, there wasn't really a political motive for writing about Sri Lanka's ghosts. It was simply because I grew up reading ghost stories, Edgar Allan Poe, Lovecraft, Stephen King, and watching horror movies. And I was a bit sick of talking about cricket because my first book was about cricket, and that seemed to be all I was chatting on. So I thought, okay, maybe Sri Lanka needs a good ghost story. And also the idea that, whether you believe in ghosts or not, but the idea is if human beings are killed unfairly, unjustly, and there's injustice in the way they were killed, they will hover around the spirit realm as ghosts. So I thought if that is the definition of a ghost, then Sri Lanka must be crawling with ghosts, because there have been many unsolved murders, unjust killings, acts of violence. So that was really my starting point. And that's when I stumbled upon this paper, which we can talk about later. But I think early on, I realized what the premise of the book was. And the premise was simply, what if Sri Lanka's dead could speak? And, whether ghosts are real or not, we can all agree that ghost stories are real. Ghost stories are there in every culture, in every community, urban or rural. And that was the idea, because we have many narratives over of our violent past, many different diverging narratives. And why don't we ask the dead, the victims of Sri Lanka's many conflicts? What would they have to say about the country and what it did to them and so on? So that was my starting point, really. And that's why it started with Chats with the Dead, chatting to ghosts.
Thank you, Shehan. Professor Sasanka, would you like to chime in?
Good to see you, Shehan. It's been a while, and I would prefer to see you in Colombo or some other place in person than this way. But anyhow, better than you see. People in my generation going to government schools and so on in the country, ghost stories were as routine as anything else. I mean, it was routine as religion, I would say. So for me, we were reading in Sinhala this really at that time, I mean, in retrospect.
Sorry, excuse me, doctor. I'm not hearing you very well. I don't know if it's just me. Or, is everyone else hearing? Is the volume okay? Okay. Sorry, maybe it's just me. Sorry, carry on then.
But can someone tell me whether there is a problem with the sound?
Sound is okay for everyone else?
Yeah, I think it's okay for me, but perhaps maybe speaking a little closer might help.
Okay. I generally think I'm loud enough, louder than the regular ghost, but anyhow, let me try. So we grew up with these things, stories of these things. I mean, it's not that given the kind of rationalist path that many of us took from early on, you didn't necessarily believe in these things, but you knew that they were an important part of our cultural setup. So, and I did spend a lot of time going during my school days, going with friends to places where the ghosts were supposed to be, houses, cemeteries, and these kind of things, spending hours trying to find these creatures and obviously not succeeding. But much later, this was part of our cultural setup. That's what I'm trying to say. So in that sense, Shehan picking on one of these as his protagonist make a lot of sense, make a lot of cultural sense. We'll come to that later. But about this paper that he was referring to, it's fairly old. But now that was also for me something where ghost stories were telling something that was much more than being scared. That was something more than horror in the sense that we generally understand these things. Because those stories from places like Anuradhapura, Polonnaruwa, Monaragala, and so on and so forth, where there was enormous violence perpetrated by the state as well as the JVP at that time. There were people who said they saw these ghosts and that they were ghosts of people who have been killed by one party or the other, and so my argument was that there were these perceptions of appearance of these creatures or these ghosts because there was unfinished business in very much the same way as Shehan's book. There was unfinished business in terms of leaving loved ones suddenly, not being able to have a funeral, not finding a body, and then obviously, the issues of justice. We know that these systems didn't work. So those ghost stories, when they were compiled, seemed to me was telling a story of these things, what was missing and what had to be addressed. So that is what I tried to do. But I must also confess, since that time, I have not dealt with this kind of thing in a long time. Okay, Thirangie, this is what I had.
Thank you. It's sort of, you're also both writing about something that's also sort of considered intangible in a kind of way because the presence is very much felt, but perhaps not them per se that's driving this cultural kind of traditions of Corville and things like that. If we come to the kind of idea of doing research, Professor, can you take us through the process of doing research for academia, both kind of in your area of expertise, but also kind of teaching students how to do research?
See, I think at a fundamental level, I'm sure Shehan will agree with me, there really cannot be a difference between research for my kind of discipline, academic work, and research for creative writing. I mean, to me, research is research. What will change, what will differ is obviously the kinds of sources that now I don't really expect a creative writer to do the kind of anthropological fieldwork that some of us used to do. They can, and some of them actually might, but it's not a necessity because research also includes looking at the bodies of work, research that has already been compiled across the world, right? So, I'll come to this in a minute, but now, before I left the South Asian University last month, I was teaching a course for the master students, and earlier in University of Colombo as well, if I remember right, and a few other places that looks at, in a very academic sense, how to do research. And it includes things like techniques, like, how to collect information, whether it is archival research, conventional library research, or whether you go to certain kinds of social, political situations, spend some time, do interviews of people, case studies, and these kinds of things, or whether you will actually compile certain kinds of information that will that people would not think are research material. There is this interesting book on Pakistan that came out a few years ago called The Government of Paper, if I remember the title right. And here, the author was looking at the ways in which files move from a place to place within government officers and the kind of power and the relationship they create. Now that is a fascinating source of information, right? So what I'm trying to say is that information can be, you have to be sharp enough and smart enough to work out in your own mind what are the best sources of information depending on a particular kind of research. Now, what is it that you want to do? Now, if it's a historical project, I have an interest in pilgrimage, the kinds of pilgrimage that Sri Lankan Buddhists make to parts of India and Nepal. And I I was interested in contemporary work, and it was also theoretical, but I did field work. But then it took me to the past. I thought it will not go beyond the colonial period, from the time that Anakarika Dharmapala set up his headquarters in Kolkata, and it also became a kind of a travel agency for Sinhala tourists who are going to various parts of India. But then it took me to the 5th century because of various material I found while I was looking for more contemporary things. 5th century in the sense that I came across these references in Indian sources and then later in Chinese sources about one of our kings from the Anuradhapura period called Kitsirimevan, who sent a delegation to India, what is now called India, in the time of Samudragupta, Emperor Samudragupta, asking permission to build a temple, a monastery for Sri Lankan monks, because he thought that they were mistreated in India when they went, without protection. And so he built this thing in what is today known as Bodh Gaya, right? Now, all that came from certain kinds of 17th, 14th to 17th century Chinese sources, plus British Indian archaeological sources of the 19th century and after. Now, see, I wasn't looking for this, but once you find these things, then you have to be perceptive enough to see whether you will go down that path and look at this material further. And I am not a creative writer. I mean, at least I don't have Shehan's skills, or probably not even his patience. But what I'm saying is, now, in the hands of a creative writer, this kind of material that an academic might find would probably become fairly important creative sources, right? To write about. Imagine you'll write something like, something that is historically based and very fascinating stories like, I don't know, Prague Cemetery or Name of the Rose kind of things, right? Because to me, the thickness of a novel will come from these kinds of material in the same sense that the thickness of a academic work will also come from how serious your research is. So in a sense, to come back to your question, now these are some of the things that I try to convince or impart to my students in the master's class called research methods, how to do this kind of thing, what to do, and also what not to do, because this is also about ethics, right? We are dealing with people. Anyway, I will stop here for the moment.
Thank you. And Shehan, you also have done kind of lots of different types of research. And if we can sort of hone in right now into specifically how you found inspiration in Sasanka's academic research, what about that work particularly drew you towards it? And how do you embed that research into your characters, the way they speak and move and understand the world around them?
Well, academic research is it's a small piece of the puzzle, I think. Just because, academic writing tends to be fairly impenetrable, even for someone with a working knowledge of English, and also there are walls around. To get to the scholarly articles, you need to pass through a paywall, and there are barriers that way. But also, I think, the fiction writer, you don't need to be as meticulous. In fact, Stephen King says, just give me enough information so I can lie convincingly. That's really, and I think Stephen Pressfield says you may read 3 books, just 3 books and stop and then start writing. And it's really, our job should be the pursuit of the story. The character wants something and the audience should want that thing or not want him to get that. And we should be caught up in the story and then we plug in the research. So for instance for Chinaman, I did, in terms of academic research, I suppose CLR James Beyond the Boundary, which is a classic about the West Indian cricket team and their rise to nation who threw cricket. I think I read that. I read one academic piece about the physics of a cricket ball, just to find out if Pradeep Matthews' doosra or double bounce would actually work according to physics. So I read that, didn't understand much of it, and I read the Duckworth-Lewis, the original Duckworth-Lewis system, didn't understand that either. But that was a tiny part, so I used that to kind of use facts, but the most of it was, what's it like being in a dressing room when the team is lost the last 10 test matches? That stuff you don't go to the famous cricketers. I lived very close to Kumar Sangakkara, but I never talked to him because the famous guys aren't going to tell you. You talk to the guys who are on the fringes, played a couple of matches, got dropped. Some guys who think, they were unfairly done by, and those are the guys who have stories to tell. And so that's where I was sort of digging around. So you have that, you have the interviews and you talk to the groundsmen and the umpires and all of that sort of thing. But also I read, cricket's fairly well documented. There's not just cricket biographies, and there's the sociology of cricket, the psychology of cricket, the zen of cricket. So I gathered a lot of this stuff, but when you start writing, you're writing by instinct and you're just following the characters. So you're not, I do have lots of, files like this and things on the wall, but in the end, you sort of write by instinct. And I think with what I got from Dr. Sasanka's paper was simply, it's not interested in whether the ghosts are real. It's more interested in the idea that wherever there has been trauma, there are ghost stories. Where there was, if there was tsunami villages, ghost stories, where there have been abductions, disappearances, apparitions in the forest and voices at night and all of that. And I made a note, I can read it here. It says, it's because human systems don't deliver justice. And I think that's a quote from this. And that's true. Look, there's no, people go missing, your child goes missing, there's no official report on it. The authorities say no one went missing, and they're kept alive through ghost stories. And so that was, for me, more interesting, that either you could read it like the book says, that the spirits are hovering around Sri Lanka because they haven't received justice, and that's the premise of Mali Almeida. Or you can view it that this is how we, as a community, keep these stories alive because there's no official record. So I think that's what I really got from this paper. And in a way, it's irrelevant whether ghosts are real because the stories are real and they have significance.
Yeah, thank you. And I think there's kind of, you can see those parallels between both your works in terms of the people who get left behind and how they understand. And even in your novel, while we do follow Mali, we also see how the people closest to him, how they react to his disappearance or potential death and the way that investigation takes place. Sasanka, if we come back to you, what did you sort of think of the representation of these ghosts, and how did you sort of connect it to that, to your childhood, like growing up with this concept of ghosts in Sri Lanka?
Sorry, I was saying that I didn't hear you well.
Oh, sorry. I was sort of talking about how when you read Shehan's novel, what did you think of that representation of ghosts, connecting it to what you were talking about earlier, kind of growing up with this understanding of ghosts in the culture?
See, before you answer, Doctor, I have to say I have post-traumatic stress from Dr. Sasanka gave a speech at the Gratian Prize. I was shortlisted and I didn't win and had a go. You remember the speech I'm talking about? It's on Ground Views.
I do.
Saying why Sri Lankan writing.
I'm getting a lot of flack for that speech even now.
No, great. We needed that. But the reason why Sri Lankan writing hasn't made it on a world stage and all that. So I'm bracing myself. Now you're asking me to critique my ghosts.
See, I'm
joking, sir.
I know. You remember my advice to you about those short stories also.
Yeah, but, I'm rewriting them now. Yeah.
Good. But kidding apart, I find this book very readable because partly because of this the things that I've been thinking at least some time ago about the kinds of things that these ghost stories actually tell us about our politics and the way in which our society has evolved and so on and so forth. So here is a ghost who's in this situation of limbo, and he has to figure out how he died within a very specific period of time. So in a way, we can relate to the kinds of as if you take it as a ghost story, you can figure out. I mean, you can relate to that as people who grow up in this particular cultural setup. But it is also a kind of a whodunit sort of detective story kind of thing. Except that in this case, the ghost as the chief protagonist is looking at this as a kind of a self-discovery. What the hell happened to me? To me, why I can relate to Shehan's book is that it talks about a lot of things over which I have also spent considerable time. Until very recent times, I worked a lot on things like political violence, nationalism, and memory in southern Sri Lanka and to some extent in the northeast. So I can the sort of things that I try to say as an academic, I think this novel says far more successfully because of the format. Because of the format, and it gives this creative license to the author to write and present stories in a way that sometimes academics like myself fail. And this is why I think Shehan was saying that some of our writings is impenetrable, and it's perfectly correct. And so my point is that a book like this has, beyond its creative potential, it also has a certain kind of social political role to play. That is to talk about in its creative fashion what exactly happened in our past. Now, I'll give you one example about this kind of fiction becoming a kind of sociological, anthropological commentaries on our times. Gunadas Amarasekar, about whose politics I have very serious reservations for a long time. But the series of small novels that he's written about the Sinhala people coming from the villages, mostly from southern villages, into the city, and this is about internal migration, getting educated, and then becoming urban and urbanized and so on. And some of them go abroad, as many of us have done, come back or don't come back. See, basically that whole story of migration and settlement in settling in the cities and then having this distant relationship with your villagers, I think Amarasekara's novels are far more detailed and sensible than any sociological literature on the subject that I have read. I've said this long time ago, and this is despite my disagreement with his Jatika Chintana kind of politics, right? So I think novels have far more, much more, I mean, when I say novels, I mean creative work has a lot more to say and do in societies than just as a form of entertainment. One more thing, and I will end. And right now, because of a keynote address I had to do in University of Delhi some months ago, I started reading about to what extent can we actually bring creative writing into sociological thinking, from poetry to fiction. And this is something I would like to talk about in times to come, not here today, but maybe I'll have a chat with Shehan too when I'm in Colombo. And because, see, there are a lot of potentials in creative writings that make sense to academic writing that we really haven't explored, right? This is something that I would like to do in times to come. Okay, Thira.
Thank you. I think kind of like what you were saying, there are differences between these mediums or genres. And I think the benefit of a novel is that we can follow the protagonist and their story. And through that process, we are able to empathize with the character. And then once we start to care about them, it can help us understand these socio-political settings a lot better. And so if I come back to you, Shehan, in academic research, everything needs to be cited and fact-checked. In fiction, not so much. So how do you determine to which extent you can blur this reality, this kind of line between reality research and fiction?
Well, I suppose it's depends on the type of book you're writing. Now with Chinaman, it was my first book, and I wasn't sure anyone was going to read it, so I sort of did it in a way that it may be seen as a true story. So I quite carefully researched Sri Lankan cricket from 82 to whenever it was 99. And every cricket match in there is authentic. Every anecdote tries to be close to the truth. The only difference is there's a Pradeep Matthew character in that. And so, yeah, I did my research fairly thoroughly, and I tried to write down to dates and scores and pitchers and umpires. I did all of that. With this one, it was quite different because obviously it's a much more serious topic here. And even though the characters were quite obviously based on recognizable figures like Richard de Soisa and Dr. Rajani Thiranagama and Daya Patirana, I think early drafts, also it took so long to do that. Early drafts, you could probably say, okay, I think that character's Prabhakaran, that character's Premadas or whatever. But I think as the thing moved along, you wanted to, I made that decision because either if you're writing about, Rohana, Vijay, Veera, Prabhakaran and all that, then you should do your research and do it thoroughly. But I thought, it's better for me to actually follow where the fiction is heading and fictionalize it. So I think while every ghost in the book is based on a real unsolved murder, and, you don't need to dig too far, you can probably, if you do your research, find out which one is which. But I did choose to fictionalize it so that it's not mistaken for journalism or being a true historical novel. But I don't think it's really that important for a fiction writer to try and get everything right. Even stuff that masquerades as historical fiction, for instance, The Crown. I love that show, and it was riveting television written by a master, Peter Morgan, but a lot of it is fabricated, and I don't know if they quite make that clear. And but I think that's where the fiction writer comes in, because there are gaps in our understanding or disputes in how we interpret certain events. So a fiction writer doesn't have to take a side, but can present a version of how things might have happened or how they may not have happened. So I don't think we should be held to as high a standard. But of course, if we get something completely wrong and there's anachronism, fine. But I think most stuff there is a bit of leeway.
Thank you. And you also do like other types of research. Like for Chinaman, in like another literary session that I attended, you mentioned that I don't know, how would you call it? Something like social research, maybe. But then you kind of sat with a lot of like uncles to get the tone and voice of the character just right. How do you blend these different types of research into that novel?
Social research, yeah. Getting drunk with uncles in the afternoon, I like it. Let's call it social research. Yeah, that dignifies it somewhat. Yeah, so I mean, that was obviously a part of it, because I'm not a big cricket fan. I know we're playing England today and a couple of wickets went, but I'm not obsessive. But I had to sort of portray one, and so one thing I did was, I hung out with, also my literal uncles, my mother's brothers, my father's brothers of that generation. I went and visited them, but also hung out with strangers and talked cricket. But mostly I was observing just how these gentlemen spoke, and their posture and the words they'd use, their mannerisms, and their spouse, their wife would be lurking somewhere in the corner, either eavesdropping or would come in and join the conversation. And I was just observing a lot of those things, which in the end, when you start writing, I think came into the characters of WG and Ari. So I think that all helps. So it can't all be academic. I mean, I could have done an academic study about, old men and their drinking habits and stuff like that. But I think that would be to miss the point. Sitting with these uncles in these, fairly, I won't say dodgy, but, not so respectable places, and listening to their stories about, it'll start cricket stories, but then everyone is an expert after a couple of shots about politics and all of that. So I was noting a lot of this stuff down, and you can see a lot of that in the book. And I suppose similar with Mali Almeida, I did do the research of assassinations and the historical research and bomb blasts and all of that. But I also spoke to the people who were people who were on the front lines, people who were affected by violence, and closeted gay men of that period. And so I think it's fairly organic how it happens, but I think, the metaphor, the cliche that's used is the compost heap. You just gather as much stuff, and I'm not a gardener, but I understand, you put all this stuff together, and out of it stuff grows. And that's a fairly useful metaphor to how stories grow as well. You can't contrive it too much, but you can absorb as much compost into the heap as you can.
Yeah, that's a really lovely way of presenting that. Thank you. Sasanka, if we can come back to you, you've done some creative writing of your own, mainly poetry. What do you think is the interplay between research and poetry?
Well, see, I guess I'm not a regular academic in the eyes of a lot of people because of these things. I mean, I do write my share of boring, impenetrable texts to get by, but I enjoy doing other things, and to me, those other things, in a way, are far more interesting, including poetry. But of course, I write most of my poetry in Sinhala. To me, poetry doesn't come in English, even though my capacity to write in both languages is probably the same. But somehow there is more of an emotional connection with Sinhala that I don't have with English. So far, all the collections that I published are in Sinhala, but there is one that I've been dabbling with in English for some time. I'll try to find a publisher for that. But to me, to come to your question, see, Shehan has a point, and that is you can't sort of overcrowd creative work with research. But I have a bias towards research. That's what I do. And most of my formal writing is based on, fairly consistent explorations, which is what research is all about. So I can't, so given that training, someone like me, if I start writing creative things, including poetry, that research kind of background cannot just be pushed away to a to an extent. Now, but research also doesn't mean you going somewhere to a library or some situation and taking stock of things very carefully. Particularly when it comes to poetry. Now, none of the poems that I've written so far will be possible if I had not read what I have read, if I had not gone where I had gone, if I had not eavesdropped on people's conversations, if I had not been angry with politicians and my fellow academics and so on and so forth, because all of that, and if I had not been frustrated with life in general, because all of these have ensured that I wrote the kind of poems that I have. So, to the extent that when they were initially published on social media, I rattle off write something and put it on Facebook or Instagram or whatever. I used to get messages from people saying, this sounds very dark. Are you okay? Is Anoli, my wife, whether she is okay? So I said, yeah. So what is the problem? Because now experiences and what you read are not, this is not necessarily real. This is what I think Shehan was also trying to say. What creative writers get is this license to start from a certain thing, which may be based on life experiences or research or whatever, and then you take it to another plane. I mean, that is the whole point. Otherwise, you'll become an academic, no? So I think that is the kind of thing that one has to remember. And for me, research, the body of work that I have done and what I have read has always been useful in writing these few creative things I've done. But I also have a feeling that if I somehow believe at some point in the future that I can manage to write a novel, that I will probably benefit quite a lot from what I've read and what is in my head, what I've seen, and so on and so forth. So, for example, long ago, I wanted to write this novel about the meeting of the Christian idea of Satan and the Sri Lankan pantheon of demons, right? And I knew about both, right, quite well. So my story at that time was Satan's headquarters was somewhere in the United States, because that I had my politics for that. But then the American Midwestern, those homegrown terrorists bombed his headquarters without knowing it was Satan's. So he was so frightened that he and his the demonic partners in the Christian sense took a flight and came to Colombo to set up their headquarters, right? But then they were confronted by the local demons, the Kalukumaryas and, all these kinds of characters, Ririaka and so on and so forth. So the whole point was I was trying to talk about contemporary global politics and local politics, but by looking at these kinds of creatures, I mean, I was trying to give them voice, because I never went beyond 3 chapters. But what I was trying to do is bring the kind of research that I was interested in at that time into something creative, but at the same time, talk about the kind of politics that I thought was necessary to talk about, in the same way that Shehan's book also talks about the politics of the 1980s, right? I mean, that is the context in which this whole novel makes sense. So this is all I will say for the moment on this.
Thank you. Shehan, what do you think of the story idea?
Oh, now I get to critique this one. Okay, great. Satan in Colombo. Yeah, I can see the colonial parallels as well. Got to deal with the local demons, and yeah, demons are much more fascinating creatures than angels. But yeah, the 3 chapter problem is quite universal. Happens to even us so-called pros. You have an idea, and then yeah, you're excited by it, and you write for a couple of weeks straight, and then yeah, you're stuck. And I think that's where either the research, you haven't done enough research. I mean, that's what I find. If I get stuck, maybe I don't know enough about this, and so I need to go back. I don't think that's the problem here. Maybe, yeah. I mean, look, there's many ways to get unstuck, but you keep going back to it. I think, yeah, even those short stories that you advised me on, I never throw anything away, because a year later you come back to it and suddenly you can see the bit where it's unstuck. But yeah, there's always space for a demon story set in Sri Lanka. There's obvious parallels. So I hope you do write it. Yeah, one sentence at a time. That's all I can say. Yeah.
Thank you. Sorry, that was a bit of a side question.
That's all right.
But Sasa, you've also translated fiction and poetry into Sinhala, and your latest publication has been a translation of Rumi's selected poetry. And Rumi was like a 13th century Persian poet who wrote in Persian, but also with the occasional Turkish and Arabic and Greek. What is that process like when you're translating across centuries and literary styles in multiple languages?
I will say something about translation, the way, you see, for an academic, I think now I have translated more creative stuff than academic things, even though I have translated quite a lot of academic tracks too. But to me, see, something has to touch me personally, to interest me to translate something, whether it's Rumi, the 13th century Persian poet, or whether I also translated what is this called, Vita Brevis, this short novel of Jostein Gaarder, the Norwegian writer, into Sinhala. And that is, it intrigued me, because I was reading this when I was in Sweden for a few months, a long time ago. And one of my friends gave me this book and said, this is very creative stuff. You should read this. And I did. She later became the foreign minister of Venezuela. And I met her recently to say, listen, I actually translated this book. And that I translated because it was blurring the distinction between historical writing and fiction, and between history and also fiction, right? And I found it fascinating. And also it allowed me the time to, the chance to revisit certain things I was familiar with, the Catholic Church at its inception, and so on and so forth. So it had both the personal interest and also this creative edge in the story. So I mean, obviously I didn't write it because of some political reason or something. It was something that touched me personally. Similarly, when I was in Japan for a few months, and I came across this book by Hisashi Inoue. It is called Jiso Face in English. It's a story about it's also about a ghost. Somebody who had died in that American bombing of Hiroshima, and it was a conversation between this ghost and his daughter, and to some extent the son-in-law. It was all about guilt of survival in the midst of that kind of carnage. So the reason why I picked to translate that was because I thought that the same nuances, the same politics, and the same problems of conscience and those kinds of things were coming up even when I was talking to people in the 1980s after the violence of the South in Sri Lanka. So I assumed that it will allow our people to read something from Japan in Sinhala, and also be able to relate to it through the local conditions, right? And similarly, the whole idea of Rumi was, I was horrified that somebody like that was not read in Sri Lanka. We can't be an island in the sense that we have become. We have to be open to global influences, global literatures, and translation is one of the only ways in which that knowledge will come to us, because there's no way we as a nation can learn all these languages. So that is out of the question. But the problem is, I was so happy to see that Shehan's book translated to Sinhala, and I was actually quite shocked that it happened so fast. I haven't read the translation, but when I go to Colombo in a few days, a few days, I would really love to read that to see how well it is done. Because these are I think the future of our creative industry, creative writing industry, and even academia depends on to what extent can we bring translations of seminal work, at least the seminal work, that is contemporary from the rest of the world to us. So I consider translation, therefore, something that is crucial, whether it's fiction or academic writing. Okay, Thirangie.
Thank you.
I'd just like to add to that. I mean, this is something I've spoken about when put the question to the fact that Sri Lankan literature, it exists in silos. You have the English-speaking Sri Lankans writing in English, which is the stuff that gets international recognition awards. But you have rich traditions of Sinhala and Tamil literature. And, I'd be very surprised if you don't get many writers who are conversant in all three. The English writers, many won't read a Sinhala book or won't be able to read a Tamil book. And I think that, it wouldn't be a bad thing for us to all learn each other's languages and read each other's novels. But in the absence of that, translators are crucial. And they are the unsung, Dilip Abesekara, who did both my books. These are the unsung heroes of, not just in Sri Lanka. Garcia Marquez, Murakami, we haven't read them. We read their translators, whose names I'm ashamed to say I can't even remember to mention, but it's a crucial thing and also there's market forces to play. So I think publishing plays a big part in this, that it has to be viable. But I think, look, we'd want to read the seminal books, the classics of Sinhala and Tamil literature, and we'd want our books also to be translated into our own country's languages. So this is something, we can talk about in conferences, and I have been doing so. But I hope that there is, and another thing for us to chat about when you're in Colombo, Dr. Sasanka, is there a new generation of translators? I know there are a few, and I've met a few, and can this be encouraged more so that we have Sri Lankan literature and it's not confined to certain segments? Sorry, carry on.
Oh, no, thank you. That was wonderful. Do you have sort of any kind of specific Sinhala or Tamil writers that you felt like your work was personally influenced by a lot? And, your book also has been translated a lot into several languages and more counting. Do these translators ever come to you for context, for ways in which for them to understand and explain the stuff that's happening in your books?
You mean the translators from other languages?
Yes.
If I may show off a bit, that's the Korean version. That's the Russian version. We just got the Russians are reading it, and then the Japanese version is in two. You can see there's a nice leopard on the cover and all of that. The publisher asked me, would I object to the Russians publishing it? And I was like, the Americans are publishing it. Why should I object to, all the warmongers can publish, should read this book. I've had some very, very interesting. This is a new thing. Look, Chinaman was, as much as I tried, it only came out in Sinhala, and my agent's publisher said, the Italians, the Americans, the Japanese aren't interested in cricket, so write me another book. That was the standard answer. And I'm not sure they would have been interested in this book unless if it hadn't won a big prize. So the prize brings curiosity with it. But I've had many interesting conversations with translators, because they're very thorough, meticulous people, and pointed out so many mistakes. This is a year after it's been published. I think, was it the German or the French translator said the van is white on chapter 3, it's black on chapter 7, and then page 300 it's white again. What color is this van? And this is after it's been through so many editions. And someone else, the Bulgarian, asked me, did Mali fall off the 6th floor, the 5th floor? Because so things like that. But also I had a very amusing conversation with, I think, the Greek or Italian translator. She called me up and said, can you explain to me the difference between Aio, Ade, Apo, Ane, Buduammo? And so I had to sit there and say, this is Ane's lamentation, Ado is like, hey, and because obviously they have to think about these things, whether they use the vernacular in their language. So for instance, the Spanish guy said, I know puta means son in singular, but I'm not going to put it into my book because it has a very different meaning in Spanish and Portuguese. But yeah, it's been a wonderful experience, and to see it, it's traveled so far. And I guess there are certain things that, even though people may not know about Sri Lankan history or politics, we all live in various degrees of dystopia. So, obviously the Koreans, who've been through as colorful a history as us, if not more so, can relate to things that are in the book. But yeah, it's been quite a rewarding experience dealing with translators. And so I do value them immensely. And I hope we have more in Sri Lanka.
Let me ask you a question, Shehan, because given my interest in translations, I had no idea that your book has been translated into all these languages so quickly. And you're right, the award probably has a lot to do with it, but still there is also obviously quite a bit of interest to do that. Now, my sense is, and I could be wrong, that this is probably one book that has been translated into so many languages, probably after Martin Wickramasinghe, if I'm not thoroughly mistaken, right? But of course, in his case, it took a lot of time. It also was translated into, many of his books into Russian, Bulgarian, and so on and so forth. Japanese too. But I have a specific question about the Sinhala one. You said Dileep Abesekara, right? Translated both books into Sinhala. Because you can read and understand both of these languages. Now, in that process of translation, did you actually have regular conversations with Dileep about, how certain kinds of things might be said in Sinhala?
Yeah, so, obviously I can't have an opinion on, the Russian or the Spanish. You have to trust the publisher and they'll pick a suitable, I can't really, but the only place, and even Tamil, I have a limited knowledge of it, but you leave it to the experts and you trust in that. But in Sinhala, yes, with the first one also, there was no publisher or agent. It was just me and Dileep involved. So, and because I can read it. So, but what I did was I gave him all my notes. So I make quite meticulous notes about what the themes are, what the characters are, what the type of... So I gave him all of that. And this was with Chinaman, but I said it same with Seven Moons. I said, don't translate it. And Dileep is not he's an ad guy like me. He written many memorable TV commercials, which you could probably Ninja, mosquito coil, gum perilier, the polo ad. These all very vernacular. And he had there's this touch for getting tone of voice. And for me, both of the books are tone of voice. So for instance, an example would be Seven Moons is written in the second person. You are standing here and so on. And I had a few translations come out, people offering to translate, and they always used Oya. Oya, hitang innewa, and the Oya didn't seem to fit. But when Dileep wrote me 3 pages, it was Numba. It was a Numba hitang inne dangba mara wedakara hira dangba marila muna karana. And immediately it was like someone scolding you in not filth, but in kind of crude language. And it just felt that that's how Mali Almeida. And the same with Chinaman, the WG in the Sinhala Chinaman, slightly rougher, works for the Dinamina, not the island, not that that's a judgment or anything, but just seems to be slightly cruder and slightly truer, I would say. And so, but I didn't go meticulously. Now, for instance, what was it? There was a reference to Godfather 4. movie that hasn't even been made, but this guy can get the DVD of it. And in Sinhala, it was Valley Katara, or it was like it was basically he took and he did, he ran these things by me, but I said, yeah, whatever feels right. For instance, at the beginning, the bodies are dumped in the Bera Lake, and there's a famous headline, Navak Gilei, Dennek Bere, Tundenek Bere, which is a pun on Bere, which obviously doesn't work in English. But when he said it, I said, yeah, fine. And he'd written it as a parody of that kind of news report. So I gave him the freedom to reimagine it in Sinhala rather than, you can't you got to pick the right creative people and let them do their thing. So we didn't have many disputes really. It wasn't like a regular meeting. He'll share, I've done 50, 60 more pages, and I'd read through them, and I'd see where he'd taken, I wouldn't say liberties, but he'd expressed it, how the kind of the working class characters, the three-wheel drivers, the cops, the body disposers, how they speak in the English version, how they speak in the Sinhala version, very, very different. Not even a literal translation, but true in spirit. And I think that's really what the great translators do. They take the spirit of the book and they reimagine it in their respective language. So yeah, I know it was a great process, and I'll be interested to hear your take on it when I'll try and get a copy of both to you. But yeah, it was a positive experience.
Thank you, and thank you for showing us the covers. I always love seeing covers of different translations because publishing houses do change the covers according to the local audience, and so it's also very interesting to see what kind of covers local audiences expect of books. Thank you, Shehan and Sasanka, for joining us. Thank you for your wonderful insights. It's been a wonderful conversation, and thank you to our audience for sticking with us through this time.